current political crisis in Nepal. So yeah, welcome, comrades. I've been meaning to prepare an educational on Nepal for a while now, and Rob and Cam did reach out to me earlier this year, and I began preparations back in January or February. However, because of work life and my recent move into my new place, I put it off for a while now. So I appreciate Bonnie May reaching out to remind me of my commitment to this presentation. And I'm also glad I waited a bit because the situation in Nepal has been extremely fluid, and pretty much every week there were new developments happening. But I want to just give an overview of the history of the communist movement in Nepal, and I've decided to talk about the current political crisis and put the current situation into its proper historical context as best as I can. So ultimately, my intent for the presentation is to highlight the contemporary history of the country, as well as some important lessons that Nepal can provide for communists. As communists of one country looking into and studying the historical struggle of the peoples of another country, approaching things from the angle of who's more revisionist and who's the anti-revisionist, it can only get you so far in properly analyzing and appreciating something as complex as a contemporary revolutionary struggle. The masses make history, but they do not make history in the ideal context of their choosing. Oftentimes, the material and class context for which the masses find themselves in will limit what the revolutionary struggle can achieve and how far it can go. And this was very much the case for Nepal. However, the continuity of the ongoing struggle of the Nepalese people for socialism shows their resolve. And as the lyrics of a popular Nepali communist song go, Marxism is not dead and history does not end. So I'll be structuring my presentation starting with a general overview of the current situation, and I will then move into a discussion of the history behind the main factions involved and why the political struggle has taken on its current form. And I will end with a brief analysis of revolution and the consolidation of state power post-revolution, and also offer up some lessons that Nepalese history can provide to revolutionaries. So for anyone interested in further reading, a book that provided a really good overview of contemporary Nepali history is Battles of the New Republic by Prashant Jha. So if anyone's interested. So I will begin. So the Nepal Communist Party, NCP, which was itself a merger/coalition government between the Communist Party of Nepal Unified Marxist-Leninist, UML, and the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist Center, formally split into its constituent parties on December 22nd, 2020, only 31 months after their merging on May 17, 2018. The conditions for their merging in the first place were due to the electoral victory of the Communist Party of Nepal Unified Marxist-Leninist in the elections of the newly formed Federal Democratic Republic of Nepal, which took place in November 2017. After winning a minority of 121 out of the 275 seats in the House of Representatives, the leader of the Communist Party of Nepal Unified Marxist-Leninist, Khadga Prasad Sharma Oli, who had now become prime minister, began the process of negotiations with his rival and opposition leader, Pushpa Kamal Dahal, aka Prachanda, to establish a unified communist government with the two factions merged into a single party with control of the House. The two leaders came to a power-sharing agreement whereby both Oli of UML and Prachanda of Maoist Center would serve as joint chairman of the party, with Oli serving as prime minister of the country. Tensions between the two leaders began to show in April 2020 as Prachanda started to voice concerns over what he deemed as Oli's disregard of the power-sharing agreement. In Oli's own Marxist-Leninist faction of the party, tensions had already been fomenting as the second in command of the faction, Madhav Kumar Nepal, had been calling for Oli's resignation as leader of the party since 2019, claiming that Oli had violated party policy by occupying both the prime minister position and the position of party leader. In anticipation of being ousted from power by the Maoist faction, as well as opposition in his own faction, Oli called on the president, Vidya Devi Bhandari, to dissolve the House of Representatives on December 20th, 2020. Prachanda and Maoist Center were fervently opposed to the dissolution of the House, claiming this to be a breach of Nepal's institutions and a power grab by Oli. 2 days later, on December 22nd, the Nepal Communist Party had officially split into its two respective parties, the Communist Party of Nepal Unified Marxist-Leninist, led by Oli, and the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist Center, led by Prachanda. Oli's own party, the UML, is now split between his supporters and those who are siding with Madhav Kumar Nepal against him. A country which for over half a century has been a theater of political struggle is now once again plunged into a new round of instability. This all taking place in the context of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which has hit Nepal very hard, as well as an increasingly multipolar geopolitical world order. So I'll move on to the historical context. So to understand the origins of the antagonisms between and within the communist parties of Nepal, we must look at the history of communism in Nepal and in doing so, we will also understand the origins of the modern Nepalese state. The communist movement in Nepal traces its roots to anti-feudal struggles that began to erupt in the mid-20th century. The original Communist Party of Nepal was founded in 1949 by Pushpalal Shrestha. Prior to founding the party, Shrestha had fought the feudal regime when he was a student in 1941 in a political movement led by the Nepal Praja Parishad, which translates to the Nepal People's Council. The Praja Parishad Party led a movement which attempted to overthrow the feudal regime in Nepal, which at the time was run by a family of feudal lords known as the Rana oligarchy. The monarch at the time, Tribhuvan Shah, Shah meaning king, was essentially a figurehead, while the Rana family held the real political, military, and economic power over the Nepali state. The rule of the Rana regime in Nepal was supported and stabilized by British imperialism in India. However, once India's national bourgeoisie had overthrown British rule in 1947, the Rana regime in Nepal had lost their British ally and were now susceptible to popular revolutionary pressure from the masses. The anti-feudal movements led by the Praja Parishad were ultimately crushed and ended in the dissolution of the organization, which, although largely made up of national bourgeois elements, young intellectuals, and lacking in mass support, is largely recognized as the first political party in Nepal. Interestingly enough, the Praja Parishad was supported by the monarch, Tribhuvan Shah, as the palace was opposed to the consolidated rule of the Rana oligarchy. So the rifts in the feudal ruling class ultimately opened the doors for the early revolutionary movement. The dissolution of the Praja Parishad led to the execution of the leadership, who were henceforth known as the Four Martyrs of Nepal. And although not a communist party, all the leaders of this early revolutionary organization were students of revolutionary Marxism. And the founder of the Communist Party of Nepal, Pushpalal Shrestha, who was a member of the Nepal Praja Parishad, would go on to translate the works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao into Nepali. So the fight between the two factions of the Nepali feudal ruling class, with the monarch Tribhuvan Shah on the one hand and the Rana oligarchy on the other, reached a fever pitch in 1951. The Rana leader, Mohan Jung Bahadur Shamshir Rana, threatened to depose Tribhuvan Shah and place his 4-year-old grandson as the new puppet king of Nepal. Due to the threat to his throne, Tribhuvan Shah fled to India to seek assistance from the Prime Minister of the newly independent Republic of India, Jawaharlal Nehru. Nehru mediated negotiations between Tribhuvan Shah, Rana leaders, and the leadership of a new political party which had formed out of the now dead Nepal Praja Parishad, known as the Nepali Congress Party. At the time, the Nepali Congress Party was the most revolutionary organization in the country and possessed its own armed wing. The meeting ended with an agreement to dissolve the rule of the Rana oligarchy and establish a constituent assembly where elections would be held. The significance of these events in the early 1950s are twofold. On the one hand, we see how the first bourgeois democratic reforms were won out of a crisis and split within the factions of the old feudal ruling class. We also now see the direct hand of a newly independent Republic of India in the internal affairs of Nepal. At this time, the Communist Party of Nepal was still small, and the main revolutionary party in the country was the Nepali Congress Party, which can be considered to be a party of the anti-feudal national bourgeoisie. Tribhuvan Shah dies in 1955, and his son Mahendra takes power and grants a new constitution which allows parliamentary elections to a constituent assembly within the framework of constitutional monarchy. The Nepali Congress Party, being the revolutionary voice of anti-feudal sentiment in the country, wins a 2/3 majority in the 1959 elections, and Vishweshwar Koirala becomes the prime minister. However, less than a year later, in 1960, Mahendra Shah dissolves the elected parliament, suspends the newly made constitution, and consolidates the palace as the sole seat of power in the country. Mahendra Shah also bans the Nepali Congress Party and imprisons Koirala as Nepal descends into 30 years of autocratic royal rule, known as the Panchayat, which translates to King's Assembly. Ultimately, the national bourgeoisie, spearheaded by the Nepali Congress Party, were used by a faction of the old feudal ruling class, the palace, to consolidate power against their rivals within the feudal ruling class, the Ranas. And in the process, the few democratic reforms that were previously granted by the palace were taken away. Should the revolutionary national bourgeoisie seek to overthrow the palace for good and take control of the Nepalese state, it could not be achieved by their class alone. With state power now consolidated, Mahendra Shah would rule Nepal through the early second half of the 20th century as a kind of populist king. Popular land reforms, which were proposed by the Nepali Congress Party, were implemented by Mahendra Shah in order to win over the masses and stabilize Nepali society. Mahendra Shah was able to play off China, the Soviet Union, and India in order to win over investment and infrastructure projects. And this is mainly due to Nepal's geographic location as a buffer state between India and China in South-Central Asia. During this time, there was great tension between India and China, as Nehru was supporting and harboring the Dalai Lama, and in doing so was showing his support for the Tibetan separatist movement, which was backed by US imperialism. Disagreements over India and Khrushchev's support for Nehru was one of the many big factors at play in the Sino-Soviet split. Mahendra Shah was able to use these geopolitical disagreements to his advantage and stabilize his own rule in Nepal. Interestingly enough, the pro-democratic forces spearheaded at this time by the Nepali Congress Party were supported by the Republic of India. The foreign policy of the People's Republic of China was to support Mahendra and the Panchayat system in Nepal, as Mahendra and Mao were both keen on weakening Indian influence in Nepal, as India's support for bourgeois reforms would strengthen the anti-monarchy forces in the country and destabilize the geopolitical buffer that Nepal provides. Within this context, with Nehru preferring Nepal move away from monarchy to potentially have a government more favorable towards India's interests, and Mao preferring stable governance, even if that means supporting the monarchy, we can begin to see the complexity of the geopolitical situation that Nepal finds itself in. Mahendra Shah would die of heart attack in 1972, and his son, the much less popular Birendra Shah, would be his successor and inherit the Panchayat system. The communist movement in Nepal would continue to grow throughout the second half of the 20th century. However, the next phase of revolutionary uprising would not occur until 1990. This particular revolution is known as the Jan Andolan, or People's Movement, and it led to the end of absolute monarchy and the restoration of constitutional monarchy and multi-party elections. This revolutionary movement was spearheaded by not only the Nepali Congress Party, which was the biggest party in the country at the time, but also the United Left Front, which contained multiple communist parties, including the Communist Party of Nepal Marxists and the Communist Party of Nepal Marxist-Leninists. This alliance between communist and Congress forces was able to call for general strikes and at its height mobilized 2 million people to march on the capital of Kathmandu in opposition to the monarchy. King Birendra was forced to remove the ban on political parties, and a new constitution was drafted in November of 1990, allowing elections to a constituent assembly. The Panchayat system was now over, and bourgeois democratic reforms were once again granted. The formation of the United Left Front by some segments of the communist movement was a worrying development to other segments of the movement due to the fact that it represented an alliance of those communist parties with the national bourgeoisie. A parallel front was formed known as the United People's Front of Nepal, which rejected the alliance of the United Left Front with the Nepali Congress Party and saw the restoration of the constitutional monarchy as a concession and compromise with the palace. The United People's Front of Nepal would adopt a much more militant line of protracted struggle, not only towards the palace, but also towards the mainstream parties, which they saw as feudal comprador forces. It is this split in the communist movement during the 1990s which would eventually lead to the formation of the two mainstream communist parties today, the Communist Party of Nepal Unified Marxist-Leninist, coming out of the United Left Front and its alliance with the Nepali Congress Party, and the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist Center, coming out of the United People's Front of Nepal. With democratic concessions won by the Jan Andolan People's Movement, the Communist Party of Nepal Unified Marxist-Leninist would continue to work from within the parliamentary system, acting as political opposition to the dominant Nepali Congress Party. However, instability within the new system would continue throughout the 90s, as factions of the national bourgeoisie sought to consolidate power within this new framework. From 1991 to 1999, the country goes through 7 prime ministers, one of which was from the Communist Party of Nepal Unified Marxist-Leninist. This vindicates the line of the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist Center, who early on saw the mainstream parties taking the concession of electoralism from the palace as being revisionists and compradors to the feudal regime. Led by Pushpa Kamal Dahal, aka Prachanda, and Baburam Bhattarai, the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist releases a 40-point declaration in February of 1996, condemning the constitutional multi-party framework and demanding revolutionary changes to Nepal's political and economic system. In Bhattarai's own words, the leaders of the mainstream parties are, quote, more interested in remaining in power with the blessings of foreign imperialist and expansionist masters than in the welfare of the country and the people, end quote. By late February 1996, protracted People's War was officially launched, and the Communist Party of Nepal Maoists would go underground to pursue revolutionary struggle in the countryside. Less than 4 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the declared end of communism, revolutionaries in Nepal began the armed struggle. The period of protracted People's War led by the Communist Party of Nepal Maoists would last from 1996 till 2008, with the party mainly focusing on organizing armed struggle amongst the country's many rural peasants, which made up over 80% of the population at the time. Tactics of guerrilla warfare were utilized by the Maoists of the People's Liberation Army to fight the forces of the Royal Nepalese Army, which were backed by a diverse group of states. Obvious backers of the Royal Army were India and the US. However, China and Pakistan also did support the Royal Army against the Maoist insurgency. The revolution itself, according to Bhattarai, was due to a crisis in the relations of production and land ownership in the country, with land ownership concentrated in a small number of hands and over 70% of the population living below the poverty line. The government of the Nepali state under the constitutional monarchy was described by the Maoists as being nothing more than an instrument for rent extraction and patronage by the bourgeoisie. Nepal's underdevelopment and political instability was also understood to be rooted in the exploitative neo-colonial relationship between Nepal and India, with Indian corporations being given advantageous access to Nepali markets since the 1950s, and Nepal's raw materials going to India and value-added goods being sold back to Nepal. This is on top of the constant political manipulation of India in Nepal's affairs. The aim of the People's War was to establish a new people's democracy and bring about a revolutionary land reform in the country. Bhattarai provided the ideological direction, while Prachanda was the tactician. By the end of the civil war, 18,000 to 20,000 people were killed. During the course of the struggle, dramatic events rapidly changed the political situation in the country. The Nepalese royal massacre occurred on June 1st, 2001, in which Birendra Shah and his immediate family were killed from within the palace. The official investigation indicts the crown prince, Dipendra, as being the killer, who after killing his family ended up shooting and killing himself. However, the unofficial or conspiracy theory, which is largely held by the masses of Nepal, is that the massacre was ordered by Birendra's brother, Gyanendra, who happened to be outside of the capital Kathmandu during the night of the killing. This is because with the royal family now dead, Gyanendra would be next in line to assume power over the Nepali state. Over the next few years, as the Maoist movement in the countryside continued to grow, Gyanendra would assume direct executive power and dissolve what was left of the bourgeois democratic reforms won back in 1990. This attempt to stabilize the collapsing state ultimately backfired. By antagonizing the non-militant political parties like the Nepali Congress Party and the Communist Party of Nepal Unified Marxist-Leninists, Gyanendra had essentially mobilized all factions in the country to align with the Maoists against the monarchy, including comprador and national bourgeois elements. This culminates in the signing of a 12-point agreement of understanding between 7 of the mainstream political parties and the Communist Party of Nepal Maoists to oppose the monarchy. Gyanendra's seizure of power also forces India to halt support of him and the Royal Nepalese Army due to them now being a strategic liability. In April 2006, the war in the countryside was complemented with a revolutionary upheaval in the cities as the second Jan Andolan, or People's Movement, takes place. With both the cities and countryside opposing his rule, Gyanendra was now forced to reinstate parliament, and on November 21st, 2006, a comprehensive peace agreement was signed between the government, the 7-party alliance, and the Communist Party of Nepal Maoists, with the Maoists agreeing to a multi-party system of government in the post-Civil War period. The kingdom would officially be abolished by May of 2008 with the declaration and creation of the Federal Democratic Republic of Nepal. In the post-Civil War period, with the monarchy overthrown, the Communist Party of Nepal Maoists, led by Prachanda, would now enter mainstream politics as an electoral political party, similar to the Communist Party of Nepal Unified Marxist-Leninists. However, the transition from being a militant party to an electoral one would take place over the course of the next half-decade. In the immediate years after the Civil War, they would play a major role in the drafting of the new constitution, which was to be a federal democratic republican constitution and would not be officially completed and in place until 2015. In the meantime, an interim parliament was convened to work on writing and establishing the new constitution, and Prachanda was elected as the prime minister in August of 2008, with Ram Baran Yadav of the Nepali Congress Party elected as president. As prime minister, Prachanda's first order of business was to attempt to consolidate communist control of the military forces in the country. The bulk of the foot soldiers of the People's Liberation Army were at this time being held in United Nations supervised barracks and were told by the Maoist leadership to give up access to their guns and munitions while the interim parliament was drafting the constitution. Prachanda calls for the dismissal of the top military general in Nepal, General Rukmangad Katwal, but he is unable to fire the anti-communist general, as President Yadav vetoes Prachanda's decision and calls for the general to hold onto his post. Prachanda accuses Yadav and the Nepali Congress Party as continuing to be puppets of Indian imperialism and preventing communists from consolidating state power. Prachanda resigns from the prime minister position, and the leader of the Communist Party of Nepal Unified Marxist-Leninist, Madhav Kumar Nepal, takes his place as prime minister in May of 2009. With the monarchy out of the way, the struggle for the consolidation of the Nepali state and fighting over the nature of the constitution of the new republic would become the political norm. With Prachanda out of power and the country moving towards a consolidation of the bourgeois democratic institutions, rather than the socialist new democracy, people's dictatorship, and radical land reforms promised by the Maoists during the People's War, would eventually lead to splits within Nepali Maoism. From within his own party, Prachanda's former comrade, Baburam Bhattarai, would eventually split from the Maoists entirely and start his own party, the Janta Samajwadi Party, or People's Socialist Party. Prachanda would be accused of betraying the revolution by joining mainstream politics without seeing to the final victory of a consolidated socialist party over the Nepali state and the creation of a socialist republic. Maoists led by senior leaders Mohan Vaidya and Netra Bikramchand would take the line that the People's Revolution in the 90s only reached the bourgeois democratic stage by overthrowing the monarchy, and a new struggle would be needed to overthrow the bourgeoisie and establish a people's dictatorship. They would split from Prachanda's Maoists in June of 2012 and return to the countryside to continue organizing the protracted People's War against the state. Prachanda would continue as the leader of his faction, which would now be known as the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist Center, to distinguish itself from the other Maoist groups in the country. They would drop their line on protracted People's War during their party convention in February of 2013. After many years of political turmoil over the terms of the constitution between the three main political factions in the country, the Nepali Congress Party, the Communist Party of Nepal Unified Marxist-Leninists, and the Communist Party of Nepal Maoists, the Constitution of the Federal Democratic Republic of Nepal was finally drafted and would come into effect on September 20th, 2015. Despite the popularity of Prachanda and the Maoists after the immediate overthrow of the monarchy back in 2008, by now, with over 7 years of political squabbles and splits, Prachanda's popularity had waned, and Khadga Prasad Oli of the Communist Party of Nepal Unified Marxist-Leninists would be elected Prime Minister on October 11, 2015. Oli, along with the Communist Party of Nepal Unified Marxist-Leninists, were never involved in the Maoist People's War and in fact opposed the peasant revolution. But Oli was briefly engaged in organizing armed struggle against the monarchy and the Panchayat system back in the 1970s and was imprisoned for 14 years. He also partook in the 1990 Jan Andolan, People's Movement, which took place mainly in the cities. And he then rose through the ranks of the party, becoming the Minister of Home Affairs and Minister of Foreign Affairs in governments led by the CP and UML, prior to him becoming the party leader and prime minister. 2015 would prove to be a more destabilizing year than usual for Nepal. Days before the adoption of the constitution, the Indian Foreign Secretary Subramaniam Jaishankar had come to Nepal to meet with Oli and other Nepali leaders in an attempt to delay the ratification of the constitution. After years of political instability playing to India's favor, the passing of a secular constitution proclaiming a unified Nepalese republic was antithetical to India's geopolitical interests in the region. Unable to halt the constitution, a blockade of fuel and other essential commodities was imposed on Nepal by India. This blockade takes place in the aftermath of the 2015 earthquake, the worst in almost a century, with over 9,000 deaths. The humanitarian crisis in the aftermath of the earthquake was made worse by the lack of fuel imports and medicine for the landlocked nation. It is in this context that Oli's rise occurs, with the Maoist camp split between revolutionaries attempting to restart People's War and revolutionaries still holding loyalty to the Prachanda path. Oli was able to distance himself from the factionalization of the ultra-left, while also distancing himself from the establishment of his own Communist Party to build a populist base among the people. Oli took a firm anti-imperialist position against India, which in the face of the hardships of the 2015 blockade, provided him with popular support from the masses. While Prachanda also took a principled anti-India stance when he was in power, the influence of the comprador politicians of the Nepali Congress Party in the government of the post-Civil War years prevented him from directly confronting India in the same way that Oli has been able to in the face of the crisis of the blockade. In the context of Nepal, to be anti-imperialist is to be anti-India. India's attempt to destabilize Nepal with the blockade ultimately had the opposite effect in the years ahead, as Oli and Prachanda would put their differences aside to become co-chairmen of the merged Nepal Communist Party after the general election in 2017. The 31 months that the Nepal Communist Party existed as a unified party leading the Nepali state was unprecedented, as the Maoist camp led by Prachanda had long ago denounced the unified Marxist-Leninists as revisionists prior to the launching of the People's War in the 90s. With the monarchy overthrown and the peasant revolution unable to smash state power and replace it with a people's dictatorship, Prachanda's Maoists now found themselves in the same political situation as the Marxist-Leninists, fighting for consolidation and control of the state from within the state. The NCP, however, was to be short-lived, as Oli's anti-establishment stance toward the old guard of his own party, as well as his principled anti-India stance, would make him many enemies. A political alliance by the anti-Oli faction of the UML, led by party veteran Madhav Kumar Nepal, along with Maoist leader Prachanda, would attempt to oust Oli from the prime minister position, and in a move to outflank his opponents, Oli would call for the dissolution of parliament in December of 2020 so that new elections would be called. Knowing his own popularity among the masses and the resentment that many Nepali people feel towards the establishment politicians of the mainstream parties, Oli's move was a calculated one with the intent of mobilizing the masses to support a populist consolidation of power outside of the party establishment. But his opposition painted his moves as anti-democratic. However, throughout the spring of this year, mass rallies in every major city of the country were held in support of Oli's move to consolidate power by dissolving the parliament, as many in Nepal understand the nature of the country's political and economic problems to be the result of a lack of consolidated government. In spite of the mass support for him, Oli was not successful in holding on to power, as the Supreme Court eventually ruled his move to dissolve parliament unconstitutional, and he was subsequently ousted from the prime minister position. However, the opposition in his own party, as well as Prachanda and the CPN Maoists, were also unsuccessful in their own attempted consolidation of power, as Oli was replaced not with an establishment communist leader, but with a veteran of the Nepali Congress Party, Sher Bahadur Dioba, a move that many believe to play into the geopolitical interests of the Indian bourgeoisie. With both communist parties now in a weakened position and the compradors of the Nepali Congress Party now in power, it's expected that Nepal will normalize relations with India, perhaps at the expense of furthering the country's economic and political ties with China. Prachanda continues to lead the CPN Maoists, and Oli continues to struggle against the Madhav Kumar Nepal faction of his CPN UML. With elections now delayed for another 2 years, political uncertainty for Nepal is once again the norm. In terms of consolidation and continuity of the state, much of the continuing instability in Nepali politics can be attributed to the lack of a consolidation of state power in the post-monarchy period. If every revolution occurs as the result of a crisis in the relations of production, then new relations of production must take the place of the old after the revolution, as the new ruling class replaces the old and stabilizes state power. Examples in history would be Napoleon's consolidation of state power after the French Revolution, or Stalin stabilizing the Russian Revolution. If we accept the contemporary Maoist line that the overthrow of the monarchy in Nepal brought the national bourgeoisie to power on the backs of the peasantry and betrayed their interests after coming to power by creating a federal republic instead of a socialist one, then we must also understand that this national bourgeoisie is itself being pulled in different directions and has many contradictory interests, which are preventing them from stabilizing the political situation in a unified manner. Communism in Nepal is a real material force that has transformed the history of the nation forever, in spite of the fact that a consolidation of the state by communists of any faction has not yet occurred. In looking back at the origins of anti-feudal movements in Nepal, we can see how intertwined it was with the emergence of the national bourgeoisie as a class in opposition to the economic and political order of the feudal ruling class. Nepal is a weak link in the chain of global imperialism, where feudal relations of production have persisted into the 20th century. While the revolutionary national bourgeoisie fought and won democratic reforms through the struggles led by the Nepali Congress Party, when those reforms were taken away by the forces of feudal reaction in the 1960s, the national bourgeoisie could not get them back without the support of the masses. And it's precisely at this juncture where communism in Nepal becomes a real political force. As Lenin says, for a revolution to take place, it is usually insufficient for the lower classes not to want to live in the old way. It is also necessary that the upper classes should be unable to rule in the old way. So why is it then that both Prachanda, the former chairman of the Maoist People's Liberation Army, and Oli, the longtime Marxist-Leninist politician, both ended up in a similar position, fighting for political power through bourgeois democratic institutions in a federal republic? To begin to answer this question, we should start with the practical differences between the two communist tendencies as they emerged in Nepal. The practical differences between Marxism-Leninism and Marxism-Leninism-Maoism in Nepal can be best understood as a split between town and countryside. Marxist-Leninist parties operated in the cities of Nepal organizing the workers, while the Marxist-Leninist Maoists organized the peasantry in Nepal's rural areas. The phenomenon of protracted people's war led by a Maoist party was only possible in the context of a struggle outside of and antagonistic to the Nepali state. And it is precisely in Nepal's countryside where state power is at its weakest point and protracted struggle can be sustained. The cities, on the other hand, were controlled and consolidated by state forces, i.e. the Royal Nepalese Army and Police. The communists in the urban areas could only struggle through its existing legal institutions for state power, while the Maoist struggle at its peak was able to control vast areas of the countryside as base areas and liberated zones. They were unable to enter the final phase of strategic offensive and take the cities. the monarchy was ultimately overthrown by the action of the Second Jan Andolan and the seven-party coalition in the city. Being unable to decisively smash the existing state and replace it by their own accord, Prachanda and the Maoists were ultimately forced in a position where the only shot at state power was through joining the very same bourgeois democratic institutions that they originally were committed to overthrowing. The continuity of the Nepali state would be fought through these very institutions, and this is why in the post-Civil War years, the CPN Maoists and the CPN UML have found themselves in a similar situation, fighting for consolidation and continuity of the Nepali state, and why both parties were able to temporarily unify and may perhaps unify again into a single communist party in the future. In terms of the geopolitical contradictions, Nepal's position geopolitically must be understood to be as one theater in a grand strategy by Western imperialism to contain the People's Republic of China. In the context of Nepal itself, the interests of the imperialist bloc are typically manifested through the foreign policy of India towards Nepal. Although aligned with the Soviet Union in its past after having achieved independence from Britain, India is today dominated by the interests of Western monopoly capitalism. The BJP government of Narendra Modi represents the most reactionary elements of the Indian ruling class. However, regardless of whether a BJP government is in power or a government of the Indian Congress Party, interests of the Indian ruling class are aligned when it comes to maintaining and securing Indian geopolitical interests in Nepal. While the People's Republic of China and its Belt and Road Initiative provides an economic alternative to the semi-colonial grip of Indian monopolies over Nepal's economy, China has always taken a pro-establishment position towards Nepal based on a mutual understanding that China would not interfere in any of Nepal's internal affairs, while Nepal would support China's sovereignty and national interests in Tibet and Taiwan. China and India's relationship to each other provides an added layer of complexity and tension, as seen in the recent border clashes between the two nations last summer. Even with the recent escalation, there does exist an unspoken agreement based on a mutual understanding that China will leave Nepal to India's influence as long as India doesn't interfere in stoking separatist sentiments in Tibet. In conclusion, the domestic political situation and the geopolitical one must not be viewed as separate, discrete phenomena, but rather should be viewed as interconnected and dialectical in nature. In the case of Nepali politics, oftentimes the outcomes of the internal contradictions in the country's domestic political struggle will be determined by the external contradictions existing in the geopolitics of the wider region. So this concludes my prepared remarks. I'd like to give a special shout out to my mom and dad for their guidance and support, and thanks to all you comrades for coming out and listening. I hope you guys found it informative and interesting, and we can move on to comments, questions, and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that covered so much ground. That was really interesting. I can keep a speakers list if that's helpful. Give you a break, Sarah. Yeah, just put it in the chat or put your hand up. I can see everybody.
I just wanted to ask about the book. What book was that again, Himesh?
It's called Battles of the New Republic. I can lend it to you.
Okay, that sounds good. Have you read that Comrade Yami book?
Not yet. I have the PDF though.
Oh, okay, can you send me that too? I want to read.
Okay.
I want to read those.
Sounds good. Yeah, Hisali Yami was the wife of the second in command of the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist.
Andy, did you have your hand up?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, I just wondered through the years, since China's adoption of socialism with Chinese characteristics, how this has affected the ideological side of Maoism in Nepal.
It's interesting when it comes to that, because of course, when they were actively engaging in armed struggle, and this is true of the Maoists in India and the Maoists in the Philippines, they denounced China as a capitalist country post 1976, and so did Prachanda, right? Like the Maoists in Nepal had the same line, It's interesting though, when Prachanda became prime minister and he had to now deal with the geopolitical reality in a much different context. The first place he visited after coming to power was Beijing. And this was a move to spite India, to kind of show like that he was moving toward China. So, that's why I kind of ended my presentation talking about how oftentimes the domestic contradictions in a domestic struggle, sometimes we do have to zoom out and look at what's the geopolitical context and what does a specific faction serve geopolitically, right? In terms of the struggle between imperialism and containing China, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes. Thank you.
Pamela, did you want me to read that or yeah? So Pamela asks, does Nepal have resources, for example, minerals, oil, that will contribute to others trying to establish control or harvest?
So Nepal it doesn't have oil. It has mineral resources and there's a lot of biodiversity. But it's not a particularly, it doesn't have any kind of really valuable, super valuable commodities. I don't believe. I think it's an exporter of rice and tea, and yeah, it definitely has minerals. But I think the main kind of reason why there's a lot of political interference in Nepal has to do with its position as this buffer between India and China. And India kind of has, like I mentioned, like there is this unspoken agreement between kind of the powerful nations of Asia that Nepal falls under India's sphere of influence, and that's the main reason why India has had such a hand in Nepali politics.
Evan, did you want me to read that? Or
I can read it.
Okay.
Yeah, like you're speaking of the Prachanda path.
Yeah.
Can you break that down a little bit more?
So that was Prachanda's synthesis, his own synthesis of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, which he, in implementing Maoism in Nepal, he was studying obviously Abimael Guzman or Chairman Gonzalo of the Shining Path of Peru. And so it's kind of Prachanda Path is kind of his synthesis in Nepal. They had Shining Path in Peru, so he had Prachanda Path in Nepal. That's my understanding of what it was.
Cam?
I couldn't unmute myself there. Yeah, I was going to ask a similar question, but maybe because of the various kinds of breaks and mergers and the kind of curious, I don't know how you would describe it, sort of politically hybrid situation there. How is Prashanda Path regarded by, I might get the communist parties confused. I was trying to keep them straight in my mind, but it comes from the Unified.
It comes from the Maoist Center.
Yeah. Okay. How is it regarded within the party today? I was under the impression that it was sort of instrumental in the articulation of its line like 20 years ago and had sort of fallen into disrepute or been denounced.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think most Maoists these days, they don't, like, they've kind of disowned Prachanda, because I guess the line is that by kind of, like I mentioned, when he joined the mainstream political parties after 2008, that was seen as kind of a betrayal of the peasant revolution, that he kind of came to power on the backs of the peasantry. And Prachanda Path was kind of how he did that. That's what a lot of Maoists are saying these days. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just have a question, and I don't know if you covered it or not, but I guess the ML party was in, like, they had some power in government for like quite some time. They were kind of, kind of in there. Was there anything like that they did, like any like gains for the people, or was there anything like special that they were able to achieve or anything like that in their position there? You know?
I can't speak to any specific policies that they did. I mean, the issue with Nepal is there hasn't really been like a mass industrialization like we'd expect in any other kind of situation, because there hasn't been a consolidation of power, even by the most national bourgeois factions, the Nepali Congress Party, when they have government. Like there hasn't really been a big push for infrastructure building yet, and this ties into the kind of unstable situation and the lack of political consolidation, largely a result of Indian imperialism. So the Communist Party of Nepal, unified Marxist-Leninists, they're also caught up in that struggle for consolidation of power, right, which has prevented a lot of kind of the positive aspects that we would want to see in terms of socialist policy. And Nepal is still quite poor. There's more development happening nowadays, but it's still a very poor country. Hopefully that'll change in the future.
Ken?
What is Nepal's relationship to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative?
So when Oldie was in power, he really did move Nepal geopolitically to align more with China. And this is partially the reason for the blockade. Obviously the constitution was the constitution proclaiming a unified republic. That's a threat to India because they've been destabilizing the situation for so long.
Mm-hmm.
But moving the country more towards relations with China definitely increased tensions between Nepal and India. I'd say relations were quite good with China rather, but now with the Congress Party in power, most political commentators are saying that the country will move away from China in the next 2 years, and it'll normalize relations with India. So this may have an effect on the Belt and Road Initiative, because I know that's going to be wrapped up in the next few years. So that's an unfortunate consequence of the split of the NCP.
Sarah's just asking if you can send your notes out.
For sure.
Cool.
So I think Cody Black had wanted to ask a question.
Thanks.
I don't think we've ever talked before, Himesh. It was a good presentation. Thank you for that. Is your family from Nepal, or what made you, I guess, choose to do this education?
Yeah, my parents immigrated from Nepal in '94.
Okay.
And yeah, I've been back 5 times in my life. Yeah, and I've been meaning to present something on Nepal since I joined the Communist Party of Canada. I mean, studying this history, it's interesting because when I became a communist, I was studying China and Russia more than Nepal, and I didn't even know that we had our own, revolutionary history in Nepal. So it wasn't until I joined the party that I dug into the history of Nepal and really got into it. And then I guess I had the opportunity to present an educational, so why not actually go and learn the details of what happened? So that's kind of how it played out.
No, it was good. I myself didn't know either. It was all new.
Yeah, it's not a very well-known place. It's a pretty small country.
Thank you.
Andy?
Yeah, Himesh, I just wondered, are there strong fraternal relations with particular communist parties in India or with the Communist Party of China? Do they go back and forth? Is there any sharing of political perspectives from their respective struggles and so on?
Yeah, I do believe so. Xi Jinping visited Nepal in November last year. And yeah, as far as the Indian connection, I mentioned the current, or the prime minister who was recently ousted, Khadga Prasad Sharma Oli, the kind of populist. He was briefly engaged in armed struggle in the 70s, and the particular village he was in is called Jaffa. And this village, the uprising in this village was largely inspired by the uprising that happened across the border in India in the village of Naxal. And it's particularly in that village where we get the kind of start of Indian Maoism. And that's the revolutionaries in the two villages were kind of inspired by each other.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Cody?
Yeah, speaking of like, I guess, relationships between communist parties, do you know what the Maoist center and their various origins, current and historical relationships are like with the CPP in Philippines, or in, I guess, organizations like the NPA? I guess, and if you know anything, I'm curious about if you know anything about I don't know if his name is Joma Sisong. I'm not good at pronunciations, but maybe if you know anything about his personal relationship possibly with Pushpa Kamaldaha. Sorry again for the pronunciation. Yeah, thank you. Great presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. So I can't speak specifically to connection between Communist Party of Nepal Maoist Center and the CPP. I'm sure there's something online about correspondences they've had, but I personally haven't looked into it, but I'm sure it's out there. I'm sure they have had communications. Because there's only a few, there's like active Maoist struggles right now. I guess Nepal, India, Philippines, and I think Turkey.
Yeah, cool, thanks. Do you know anything about the historical relationship possibly between Sison and the person who the Prashanda Path is named after?
I'm not sure. Like I don't know about if they've had correspondence personally, but absolutely.
Thank you.
Cam?
I had a question about people talk about the kind of rural urban divide where, oh, wow. I could have just turned that light on. Wow. Where the Maoist insurgency is concerned and protracted People's War and so on as being like a guerrilla strategy from. But I was wondering if, because I was just reading about the urban strategy, I guess, of the CPI Maoist, which is a pretty interesting document. And I was wondering about the urban strategy of the Maoists, I guess at various points over the last 20 years, because I thought that, where like general strikes and urban tactics like that were concerned, because I thought that there was, that one of the things that set it apart, and this could be a really botched understanding, was a pretty robust kind of urban presence too, where strike actions were concerned.
Mm-hmm. So most of the stuff happening in the cities, my understanding is that it was primarily the Marxist-Leninist factions, even the more militant actions. I mean, I heard of like, there would be like small bombings and stuff that some of the Maoist splinter factions would carry out. But as far as the kind of like the big push in the cities was the first and second Jan Andolan, and that was primarily Marxist-Leninist parties. so I feel like it was primarily an urban-rural divide in terms of the two parties. I can't speak specifically. Obviously I wasn't there, but yeah, like I'm sure there was. Like I heard that the YCL was pretty militant. I don't know who they were, if it was a particular YCL of one party or another, or which one they were with. But I know there was like an urban presence of the YCL during the People's War. Yeah.
Well,
I'm just learning a lot.
and I sometimes wonder, I remember reading about like big general strikes in Kathmandu in the, like the Western bourgeois press that were attributed to Maoists kind of generically, and like they were, I think like big alliances underwriting those. And I wonder how.
Yeah. Actually, when Prachanda was unable to dismiss the anti-communist general immediately after the People's War, and he stepped down, he called for a massive strike, like of people like in the urban areas who were aligned with him, like because he was unable to consolidate the military. This was after like 2008, 2009.
That must be right around. Yeah, that must be right around the same time. And I was wondering how much of that was actually Maoist, or if if it gets kind of
it's kind of
muddled to the.
It's like the masses are kind of responding to the political situation, and I guess at that moment they were very much aligned with the Maoists, because coming out of the People's War, the Maoists were the most militant faction, and once all the other parties kind of started trailing the Maoists, and that gave Prachanda that legitimacy. But once he was unable to consolidate state power, unable to dismiss the general, that's when he called for like a mass mobilization in the cities. Yeah.
That's great. I want to know more about that.
Evan has a comment. Do you want me to read it out? You can just give me a thumbs up if you do, or you can read it. Okay. Do you have any knowledge on what kind of relationship Canada has with Nepal currently?
I don't have anything specific to go off of, but I do follow Khadga Prasad Sharma Oli on Twitter, and pretty much anytime any major international event would happen, he would kind of tweet something about it. And so interestingly, you would see him, tweet things, about the U.S. election and talk about supporting Biden and stuff, which is kind of cringe. But for Nepal, I feel like a lot of the politicians who are in positions of power in the Communist parties, they're going to try and have good relations with as many countries as they can, including if they can have good relations with imperialist countries, they will pursue that. Like, for example, Nepal does have good relations with, for example, Israel, and obviously that's not great from if you support Palestinian national liberation. But then it's at the same time, it's like Nepal is such a poor country that you kind of understand why they're trying to have good relations with as many countries as they can at the same time. So I can't speak to specifically Nepal's relation to Canada. Canada does not have an embassy there, I don't believe.
Henry, I saw something pop up on your screen. Was that, did you have were you indicating you wanted to speak, or was that just, did I imagine that? Maybe I was imagining that. Okay.
Maybe, what was that author that you mentioned, Evan and Himesh, the woman who was the wife? I think I remember I think I know who she is, and I'm just trying to think of it if it's the same person. What was her name?
It's Ilayami. I'll write her name in the chat.
I think I've seen her. Cause she's written stuff.
Yep.
Okay.
Cam. I don't know. It's a bit silly to keep a speakers list.
Sorry. I don't know.
No, go ahead.
I'm trying to follow the rules. This isn't even really I don't know if this is even a question so much as it's just an interesting thing, but I think that Prashanda was at the landless, the landless workers movement schools in Brazil. I know that Comrade J. Watts was attended that, and I believe he said that Prashanda was there and spoke to people, which I was that surprised me. I think at that time I didn't really understand the I think I didn't really understand the terrain, and I wouldn't have expected him to be there. And apparently his appearance, people had opinions about it, but he was interesting. I don't know.
No, that's a cool anecdote.
I'm sorry if I interrupted someone to say that. And
how does the religious complexion of the Nepalese people play into the movement for socialism?
It plays a very big role because Nepal is a Hindu majority country, and like one of the big criticisms of the communist movement is that the leadership was primarily Brahmins, like high caste Hindus, primarily from the hill region, which has always historically kind of been dominant over the plains closer to India. And so there is a lot of there's a lot of ethnic groups in Nepal, and yeah, one of the big criticisms is that the leadership perhaps does not fully represent the interests of the minority tribes of the region. And there is that component of like Brahmanism, which Maoist groups kind of have the most militant line against. They say you cannot overthrow just capitalism in South Asia. You have to overthrow Brahmanism because it's so intertwined in the kind of the system there. And yeah, there's an interesting book called Critique of Brahmanism by Ajit, who is a Maoist in India. And he goes really in depth into the role that Brahmanism plays in kind of the mainstream parties in India. And I think that's very much applicable to Nepal as well.
Can you send me the title of that book and publisher?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So does Hinduism play a primarily breaking kind of reactionary position in the movement towards socialism?
I'd say so. I'd say kind of like the caste system is very deeply rooted in like the feudal mode of production, as well. And I think, yeah, that's one of the big criticisms of the movement is that because the leadership was always of this hill Brahmin constituency, that definitely kind of prevented consolidation in some ways, because a lot of the tribes people in the kind of non-hill regions of the country, they had their own kind of political movement after the overthrow of the monarchy, because they kind of saw the political instability as just being, these Brahmins in the hills, kind of fighting for the seat of power. But where's our national identity, and like where's our stake in this? And so there is that movement as well, which I guess communist parties have to study and understand.
I know that in the Philippines during the CPP People's War, especially in the 80s, there were a lot of Jesuits and religious sisters, Catholic in this case, aligned with the Maoist movement, and a lot of them were martyrs too, I suppose. Did that happen with any Hindu sects in Nepal during the People's War?
I'm honestly not too sure. I can't
Okay.
speak to that.
Evan put a comment in the chat here. I don't know if everybody has the chat open.
Yeah, that's just the book we were kind of discussing on like women's liberation. It's a, yeah, there's a PDF online available.
Cool. Cody.
Hey, yeah, just I'm curious about, I guess, the situation with US imperialism on the ground kind of in Nepal, and how much influence that there is in, I guess, in the media, and among people's beliefs, and I guess even among like things like NGOs, like US aid and stuff like that. The reason because I noticed that Prashanda attended a scholarship on the US aid, or was funded by US aid. So I'm just curious how deep I guess US imperialism kind of reaches into Nepal currently, and how the Communist Party's various plays into power have affected that as well, possibly.
Yeah, it definitely plays a role, and NGOs are a big kind of problem actually in Nepal, because they kind of try and exist outside of political jurisdiction, and so there's a big effort by communist parties to kind of curb the influence of NGOs in the country. I haven't looked into it too much, but I did see on the actual website of like the National Endowment for Democracy or whatever, that CIA front, they have operations in Nepal. So there is, and that's like a direct kind of US operation. So the US does have operations on the ground in Nepal, but typically like the interests of Western imperialism are going to be manifested through India's manipulation of affairs in Nepal. But yeah, there's definitely a presence of US interests on the ground, primarily in the form of NGOs.
Great, thank you, Himesh.
Is there a queue?
No, go ahead.
Okay, I mean, this might be kind of where it left off, and maybe it's just like too big a question, but I can't parse what's going on in the media right now. Like this month, I mean, I might almost be asking you to repeat something you said that might have washed over me, but like, it seems it seems like there's some kind of like constitutional crisis happening right now, and I'm not sure where Oli is at, or what is expected to happen in the wake of the parliament being, I'm not sure what the word would be, but like dissolved.
Yeah, I think that's the correct word.
Okay, yeah. Like what's like what is next? That maybe that's an enormous question that is foolish to ask, but
no, it's totally fine, because literally last week, like they put a new guy as the prime minister from the Congress Party. But basically, when Oli dissolved Parliament, the whole constitutional crisis was over whether that was actually like constitutionally valid to dissolve Parliament. And this was a move to outflank his opponents, because by dissolving parliament, he could call for elections in November. But the constitutional crisis was resolved because there was something in the constitution that allowed the next leader to delay elections by 2 years or something. My dad literally told me this like yesterday, so I'm also fuzzy on that. But so basically now this Congress guy, Sher Bahadur Dioba, he's the prime minister now, and he can rule for 2 years, which is like, that's a long time for considering how fast things move in Nepal. So that's why it's kind of an unfortunate situation, because I mentioned this is gonna move Nepal's relations with China. They're gonna curb their economic and political ties with China and kind of move more towards India. So yeah, like I guess the fighting over the constitution was primarily over whether Oli's move to dissolve parliament was actually warranted in the constitution, and it wasn't. So he was kicked out.
I realize as I'm asking these questions that so much of what I know is filtered through bourgeois media, and so much what I know, the New York Times and so on, that Oli was portrayed as kind of I thought a COVID denier in some sense, and in some things I read. I'm curious, like maybe this is an unrelated, but I'm curious about the situation with COVID there, and if it's in a similar situation to India, and how things are going at this moment with the pandemic.
Yeah, he said some funny things. He said a lot of he said that yoga was invented in Nepal, and he was trying to anger Indians by saying that. But yeah, he did say that just like drink water and turmeric, and then you'll be good against COVID. So yeah, he said people call him Ghaffari in Nepali, and Ghaffari means like someone who just like says random shit. I don't know what the direct translation would be. But yeah, I guess that's sort of his populist charm in a way. He says he wants to make Nepal like a socialist Singapore or something, which is like, if you could do that, by all means, raise the living standards. But yeah, he does say a lot of things. I think he claimed that the Hindu god Ram was born in Nepal, and this is also a move to anger a lot of Indians.
Are all the books that are being recommended in the chat?
I'll put some of the ones I talked about.
Himesh, I don't know when you became a communist, but have you gone to Nepal since you've been a communist? And this is just a random question, but is there any like cool communist stuff, like museums or like anything cool, like some statues or anything?
So I have been there since I've been a communist. The last time I was there was summer of 2019. And yeah, every bus or most buses will have like Che Guevara's face on them, which is kind of cool. Close to my uncle's house, there was a Communist Party office. I don't know which faction. I didn't know anything about Nepali communism back then, so I don't know which faction whose office it was. But yeah, like as far as big statues and stuff, there isn't much. It would be cool to see like a Lenin statue or something in Nepal, but yeah, they don't have much of that. They have statues for like old kings and stuff, which I guess I understand why they have those, but it is kind of funny because like there was such a struggle to overthrow feudalism, and now there's like a statue of a king. But yeah, it would be cool to see more communist stuff in Nepal. Perhaps as more infrastructure and more things develop, we'll see more of that in Nepal, hopefully.
Yeah, that's interesting. What's the connection with like Che on buses? What do you know what that's about? Or
I mean, a lot of the buses, this is true of India too. People put all kinds of art on the buses and on the trucks and stuff. Like there's like lotus flowers and like paintings of all kinds of like Hindu imagery. And so yeah, I guess communist imagery also makes its way on there.
Douglas has a comment here. Douglas, do you want me to read that out loud, or I'm not sure what to do with the comments. Okay. More of a comment than a question, but it's interesting to see both of the communist parties getting drawn into the bourgeois government. It sounds like it was the best option at the time since they were unable to smash the state, but it certainly illustrates the dangers of trying to take over the state from within.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, yeah, there are groups still trying to restart People's War. However, I don't think it's, they may have the most correct line in the sense that, yes, perhaps at this time, the Communist parties, the mainstream ones, are perhaps representatives of the national bourgeoisie. That could be totally correct line, but sometimes I think trying to restart the People's War in a country that already had a decade of People's War, it doesn't, even if they have the correct theoretical line, I don't know if that's actually the best given the current conditions of the country. So I do agree that, you know, the way the country developed, I think a consolidation, the best scenario would be a consolidation of state power by a single communist party within the current institutions they have, and move the country more towards relations with China and develop infrastructure. That would be the most realistic outcome. And like, it could happen relatively soon. Like the next 2 years are kind of uncertain just because the Congress party is in power, but you know, that would be the best option. I don't think renewing the armed struggle in the state the country is currently in is probably the best. And a lot of the splinter factions right now, the Maoist splinter groups, they don't have the same kind of mass support that the Communist Party of Nepal Maoists had in the 90s. And, you know, you never step into the same river twice, right?
Yeah.
So I think if things were going to go in that direction, regardless of who the leader was of a particular faction, I think there was going to be kind of the continuity of the Nepali state was going to happen through those institutions that were laid down in the 1950s with the first push for bourgeois democratic reforms. So I think swapping one leader for another, or kind of changing the leadership, or doing a counterfactual in that sense, it wouldn't have necessarily changed the trajectory of how things played out, is what I'm trying to say.
Cam?
Yeah, this is certainly something that has been gone over, but I just want to make sure I have it sorted out in light of something you just said. So when you talk about the ideal situation being like a single communist party, was the merger of Maoist Center and the Communist Party of Nepal, was that like an electoral alliance, or was that a proper party merger? Like, did they form a single new party, or was that just combining forces for an electoral alliance?
It was kind of both, because the party name changed. Like they became the NCP, the Nepal Communist Party, but then they did it in order to, you know, merge their seats. So it was kind of both. And yeah, it was very unprecedented, right? Because I meant like both parties came from different origins. One was engaged in protracted struggle. The other was always kind of using the bourgeois democratic institutions. And that's why it was such an unprecedented thing. But they both ended up in the same position, struggling for power in those institutions. But yeah, it was. Yeah, it was. I lost my train of thought. But yeah, like the merger was quite unprecedented in that sense.
Did it absorb many other groups or was it really just the two or three that?
It was just the big two. But you bring up a good point that just kind of got me going. There, you know, I mentioned there are these splinter factions engaged in trying to restart the People's War. When the party split, like the mainstream party, the NCP, when it split, so did the parties in the countryside. So they split as well, so they were kind of trailing the mainstream political parties. So one of the main leaders of the groups that are trying to restart People's War, he goes by Biplav. He actually came out of armed struggle and endorsed Oli, which is very interesting because he was like third or fourth in command of the original Communist Party of Nepal Maoist. And he didn't, now he's going against Prachanda. He's like, no, Oli is kind of the populist that I'm gonna come out of armed struggle to endorse. And I thought that was very interesting.
That's super interesting.
Yeah, I saw he was involved in some bombings and stuff. That guy. So that's pretty crazy.
Yeah. So that's why, like I mentioned, Oli was kind of trying to do this populist consolidation outside of the establishment of the communist parties. And he brought the Maoists, he brought a faction of the revolutionary Maoists with him temporarily. It didn't succeed in the end, but it's interesting that that happened.
I'm just going through the chat and copying and pasting the books. I'm interested in this Brahmanism book by Ajith because I've read a bit of his. Ajith is pretty hostile to this whole sequence. That's true. Like I thought that Ajith had said pretty unsparing things about Prachanda and the new party and all that.
Yeah, I feel like Ajith would align with Biplav and like the Maoists who are trying to restart People's War. I feel like that's where he would align. Interestingly enough, the college that my dad went to in South India was the same college that Ajith was studying at. And Ajith was there like 4 or 5 years prior to my dad being there. He was really involved in like the revolutionary student movement on that campus. And there was some big student uprising when he was there that him and his organization were organizing. And he dropped out of school because of the cops were kind of on his trail, and that's when he kind of went underground. Just an interesting anecdote about Ajith. Interesting guy.
Was that in Kerala?
In Kerala, yes.
Which city?
I'm not entirely sure,
Okay.
but it was in South India. It was in Kerala.
How are you feeling, Himesh? Should we do like a last call for comments and questions, or do you just want to have an open, I don't know, chat about something, or yeah?
We can just have an open chat. If people have comments or anything, we can go off topic if they want.
I don't necessarily want to veer off topic. I just feel like there's so many threads to follow. Like I very new to a lot of this history, and
Me too, actually. There's a
it's
lot.
great
Like
because
I didn't realize like how complicated the situation actually was, and I had a very kind of simple understanding of things. But the more you dig into it, there's just a lot of history.
it's not just that, you know, when I talk about the kind of coverage you see in, well, geez, I don't know what, the Guardian or the New York Times or something. It's not even that it's not just that it sort of mystifies all the splits and the differences in emphasis, and seems to treat one kind of undifferentiated, like Maoism or something like that, you know, insurrection. But it also, like, you don't hear about it really at all. There's this sequence unfolding, and it doesn't seem like it's covered very well by, you know, even the standard, like the Guardian, for example, you know, kind of the furthest, I say this very cautiously, left of the bourgeois papers, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe it's just like a lot of info just doesn't get out as well. Like I feel like Nepal, it's small, and there is a diaspora, but you know it's such a, like, the revolutionary history, when you dig into it, is so complicated that like I kind of want to present this to like a lot of the Nepali people in Winnipeg and kind of, you know, see what they say, because like a lot of the young people I grew up with, you know, Nepali Canadians, a lot of them are communists too, but they don't actually know the intricacies of this history. And I think that could be a potential for radicalizing comrades here in town, and maybe bringing them into the party, because there is a Nepali community here in Winnipeg, and like there are like young people there who are like communists, but even my sister is a communist, and she didn't know any of the details of this history until I presented it to her yesterday, because it is such a complicated thing that happened, and there's a lot of layers to go through, and I think it could be a potential for radicalizing, or at least educating, Nepali Canadians. So I'm glad that Rob recorded it and is putting it online.
Andy, I think we've done away with the speakers list format. So you want to people can just jump in, I think.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, I just thought of an interesting kind of geopolitical parallel site of action, which is the Khyber region of northwest Pakistan. Again, like a feudal society, largely, where both kinds of Islam, Sunni and Shia, are strong. Sunni is the strongest, but also because of American imperialism and the war in Afghanistan, it's very, very close to the border. They had their own experience of war in the 1990s. The role of religion seems to me, well, I've read quite a bit about this situation in northwest Pakistan. It seems very similar. The breaking sort of force of people's religion upon socialist ideas, even on democratic ideas. One of the things I wanted to ask you was on the role of women in Nepal since, let's say 1985, 1990. Mm-hmm. And I'm speaking now like of the villages. If you have a caste system, has there been movement on that front?
I think that's one of the sort of, I don't want to say like failures, but that's one of the problems, I guess, that with the communist movement in Nepal, is that it didn't adequately address, when it came to power, it didn't adequately address a lot of the gender issues in terms of how the caste system reifies that. But yeah, I would say things have changed. I don't know. I haven't been to like a real like rural Nepali village in a long time, but just in general, there is more access to birth control, I'd say, in the past few decades. But yeah, there's definitely more progress that needs to be made on that front. And I think that goes hand in hand with developing Nepal's infrastructure and raising the kind of, living standards of the people. There will be more gender equality when, I guess, the people are suffering less and they can come out of those maybe more dogmatic caste beliefs and religious beliefs.
Thank you.
I don't have a question or a comment or anything. I just wanted to say, as it's winding down, like, thank you very much for the presentation. My notes are like, I was trying to keep up, but yeah, there's so much there. I'm really thankful for this context.
Yeah, no problem. I'm glad I got to present. I haven't done something like this in a long time. I was super nervous to do this, but I'm glad I did. And this is, now that I kind of have an idea of the history, this is something I can carry with me the rest of my life, and I can always talk about this to people and to Nepali people, family. I can engage with the history at a different level than I could before, which is very, very nice.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really great. I have I just want to show you I was also trying to keep up. I have a sticky note like
Oh my God.
catastrophe down there. So
That's a
I
very
just use a single sheet of paper. I don't know.
Yeah, you went ham.
Yeah.
These are very good signs, and thank you. Yeah, from my part, thanks so much, Himesh.
Thanks, Himesh.
It's a fascinating sight of contradictions and progress, and many of the, I don't know, bourgeois democratic and socialist questions we all think about. Yeah, thank you.
No problem. Yeah, the more I would read about this stuff, the more I would have to grapple with a lot of the questions that are raised by the Nepali struggle. So yeah, it was such a great opportunity joining the party and getting to present something like this.
It does show how politics is much more complicated in a semi-feudal society than it is in a capitalist society where most of the classes have been destroyed, basically, or absorbed.
Yeah.
Yeah. When there's a lot of infighting in the ruling class, yeah, things get very complicated.
And within the working classes of
Within the working class
too, there's different interests and
then the workers and peasants too. It's another layer.
Yeah.
Just to respond to Cody, the next educational, there isn't a date set for it yet. But I think the next one is going to be Lenin's address to the All Russia Youth League, and we might do it as like a group reading, and then discussion afterward. So, but we'll figure that out soon because it'll be in August.
Right on.
I'd recommend people to visit Nepal if you can, in the post-COVID world, if possible. Lots of good tourist stuff to do there.
Love good
Like
biodiversity.
Lots of animals.
Should we wrap it up? I don't want to cut things off prematurely, but it's 8:45. Yeah. What do you think, everybody?
Yeah, we can wrap it up if everyone's down.
Yeah.
Do the book group after after
Yeah.
everyone reads Battles of the New Republic. But,
Yeah, totally.
It's a good one. I got this copy in Kathmandu, actually. Because yeah.
are there a lot of English language bookstores there? Or?
There were when I went. Interestingly enough, I couldn't find a lot of communist related texts in English there, but I did find like Communist Manifesto in Nepali, which I can't read yet. I will learn Nepali at one point though. I will. It'd be cool to go back and maybe translate stuff if I ever learn how to read it.
Can you speak it?
Maybe like 40-ish% fluency in speaking. Yeah.
When you were growing up, did your parents speak to you in Nepali and you answered in English?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, my Russian and Ukrainian friends used to do that all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't until like recently that I started like putting in more effort to actually learn it. Once I became a communist, and I learned about this stuff, I started taking a bit more interest in picking up the language.
Sure.
Great. Well, thank you again so much. Yeah, this was fantastic.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Himesh. That was really, really fantastic.
Yeah,
You,
no problem,
Himesh.
guys.
It's great.
Okay, good night.
Good night, everyone. Take care.
Good night.